So thank you for having me. I am so sorry that I'm holding you back from your lunch, but hopefully what I'm about to talk to you about is so interesting, you can hold those hunger pangs back a bit longer. Hello, I'm Collette, and as I said, I'm Managing Director of a Brand and Strategy Consultancy. Having sat in a few of the presentations this morning, I'm going to talk to you about something totally different. I'm not going to talk to you about technology. I'm not going to talk to you about science, and believe me, I'm a brand consultant. You really don't want me to talk to you about scientific advances. But in our consultancy, what we specialize in is helping a breadth of organizations really drive positive and particularly social change by unlocking the power of brands and really understanding the audiences that can help them drive those changes. So what I'm hoping to do over the next 20 minutes or so is introduce you to a few tools to help you maybe understand what positive change looks like for your organizations, how you might determine the positive change that you want to drive, and then how you can communicate to a breadth of audiences in order to help you deliver that. And hopefully it will be relevant and interesting to you along the way. We are going to move away from sort of science and tech and into the realm of marketing and communications. Just before I kick off with the presentation, I just want to get a sense of who's in the room, because there's been a breadth of presentations. So how many people here would say that they run a business or work in a business? Oh, good. Okay. How many of you see yourself as leaders? Again, good. How many of you would see yourself as marketeers? Good, because actually, in this day and age, our ability, even as individuals, our ability to lead and drive change means that we should all be seeing ourselves as leaders, whether we run our own organizations or work within them. Equally, marketing, we live in a branded world, folks, so actually these skills we're going to teach you are relevant for everybody, no matter what sector you're in. Right, that's enough of preamble. So the first thing to say, this is a double-headed presentation. Driving positive change, communicating changing demographics. So I'm going to start by talking about driving positive change. There's been a massive conversation, particularly this year, within kind of broader business community about the value and the responsibility of driving change. Whereas once before we had organizations that were responsible for driving social change and doing good, and we had organizations that were responsible for driving profit. Those two things are now one and the same. And actually, it's a growing demand from consumers, from different audiences, that as businesses, no matter what we do, we have to be seen to drive positive change and act with purpose. That's part of what we do. And what that positive, and you can see here a couple of sort of headlines around it, both in the trade press, but also actually in wider business press. So earlier, I think maybe last year, the chief exec of BlackRock Investments, a massive investor, wrote an open letter to CEOs calling for businesses to start putting, and business leaders to start putting purpose at the heart of what they do. So actually, the topic of this presentation couldn't come at a better time. So for us, so again, I said we work as a brand consultancy. We help organizations drive social change. We look at what that means. For us, we talk about that meaning three, sort of doing one thing, and that's about win-win-wins. So we've heard about win-wins, right? Wins for us, wins for our business, wins for our audiences. Brand by Me, we talk about win-win-wins. That means wins for our customers and audiences, because without them, we wouldn't exist. Wins for our business, because it needs to be sustainable and profitable for us, and that's really important. So it shouldn't be change or positive impact at the expense of good business. They need to come hand to hand. But the third win, and I think what those headlines were referring to, was about creating wins that benefit the world around us. So looking beyond the scope of our organizations and our customers and our direct remit to look at how we can inspire change. And that's what we mean by positive change. It's about an ability to drive all three. Win for our customers, wins for the world around us. And that win for the world around us looks different. And I'm going to talk in a little bit about a tool we use to look at what that might be. But it can be anything from looking at our contribution as businesses to the wider environment, to our local communities, looking at ourselves as employers and making sure that we're positive employers. Thank you, sorry. But also just looking at how we can do business in a way that delivers positive impact. And so that's what I'll introduce you to a tool in a bit about that, but I want to move forward and look at the other bit of the presentation title, which is about communicating to changing demographics. Before I do, I've got an example of positive change. So this was a couple of years ago, and the head of sustainability at IKEA stood up at a conference and said something that really shocked a conference. I think it was a Guardian business conference. He said, if we look on a global basis in the West, we've probably hit peak stuff. Peak stuff is one of my favorite kind of phrases and words. Very surprising for the head of sustainability at IKEA to be saying, actually, we've got to a stage where we've just got too much stuff, particularly in the West, but all too much stuff. When he said this, there were like gasps of horror around the stage that he was on and around the audience. It was akin to, I don't know if any of you remember the jewelry chain Ratner's. The CEO of Ratner's stood up and said, our jewelry is crap. That business no longer existed. People kind of felt that this was the same thing. The head of sustainability at IKEA saying that we've got too much stuff, how does that work? Actually, this was a clarion call to action for them about how they were going to drive positive change and help their audiences do so. At the beginning of this speech, he said, we've hit peak stuff, and here's how we're going to help address that. IKEA are looking across a number of things, from looking at recycling and repair programs within their furniture, next year testing out furniture rental as opposed to purchase, but also looking at how they can they made a commitment in 2020 to that all their factories will be powered by clean energy. So it's an example of how they are delivering positive change through their business. And actually, although it was a shocking statement and people might think it was self-defeating, actually it was a really clear call to action that we need to do better and that we need to look at the positive change we can achieve. So of course, that's a big brand doing it. What I'm going to talk to you about in a couple of slides' time is a tool that we use to understand how organizations, no matter where they are, can really look at the positive change we want to drive. Before we do so, though, I'm not going to dwell too much on this. I had loads of stats for you, but in the interest of time. Changing demographics. So this was about driving positive change and communicating to changing demographics. There are any number of demographic change we're seeing, from growing population, aging population, the growth in more diverse populations, particularly looking, if we're living in London, looking at the growth of ethnic minority populations, and finally, looking at the growth in single households and single-person households. These are the examples of wider demographic change that have massive impact on our businesses. Now, I was going to talk to you about how some of these trends are affecting sort of the veterinary profession. However, having heard a lot of talk about farm animal welfare, I'm not sure how relevant some of these things are going to be. But the point being, actually, in a world where the profile of our audiences is changing rapidly, how can we make sure that we are able to communicate to them, that we're able to understand their needs? I've got three, hopefully, on the next slide. How can we make sure that we're communicating to a shifting and changing demographic over time? How are we able to communicate to people regardless of maybe what their age, gender, location are? The answer is by stop focusing on demographics. Demographic targeting is useful in maybe nowadays one environment, and that's if we're looking at communicating to people through paid media, because that's very much still how people buy media. So you buy it by age and location, and it helps you stop wasting loads of money. But beyond that, if we're truly looking to communicate with people, if we're truly looking to engage people, as some of the students talked about when they were looking at their apps, if we're truly looking to understand our audiences, it's really important that we move beyond demographics and look at a broader way of targeting and understanding our different audiences. So what I'm going to do now is hopefully introduce you to kind of 3 tools we use within our brand consultancy that help us understand how to help our clients drive positive change within their sphere and look at what that means, but also look at how we can maybe engage with, understand and communicate to different audiences. So there's 3 things. The first one, I'm going to show you a framework to maybe understand who we are as businesses, because actually before we can understand the different demographics audiences we might want to reach, before we can understand the change we might want to influence, it's really key we understand who we are as businesses, and individuals actually. The second one, I'm going to talk to you about how we move to understand our audiences beyond demographics. And then finally, I'm going to maybe talk to you about how you join up the 2. So how you use your understanding of who you are and your understanding of your audiences to create a relationship between them. This is where it gets, well, actually, having seen the slides from other presentations, I'm not going to worry about getting too technical, because actually, but this is about marketing technical, which is not the same as the technological and scientific advances you've seen on the screen earlier. So, the first one, I said, in order to understand and maybe look at both how we drive change and also how we communicate to a very changing and shifting demographics, we need to understand who we are. That might sound a bit self-absorbed, but it sort of makes sense, doesn't it? If we understand ourselves, if we understand who we are as businesses, we can then work out the audiences that benefit from that and also the change we are best placed to drive. This is a framework we use. I haven't called it brand framework, but it is effectively that. There are 4 elements to us helping us understand who we are as businesses, as organizations, and even as individuals. So those 4 elements are, first and foremost, purpose. What are we in the world to do and why do we exist? This is really useful when we think about driving positive change because we can understand our purpose is the sum total of those things that we're great at, that we're passionate about and make us stand out, and an understanding of why the world needs that. And where those 2 things come together, it's really powerful because in understanding our purpose as businesses, beyond what we do on a day-to-day basis, but more why we exist, it helps us uncover what that positive change might look like for us. What's the change of all the big global issues in the world? Which are the ones that we are best placed to make an impact in? So that's the first element of who we are that's really key. If we look forward, once we've established our purpose, vision is another really useful tool that helps us really unpick and understand who we are as organizations, businesses, as individuals. Vision is normally described as the future what the world looks like in the future. But that's quite vague. We define it as if we're delivering on our purpose successfully, what the future looks like for us. So the idea being, you identify your purpose and your role in the world, you look forward and you go, what does the future look like for us? Again, really useful if you think about understanding and what the positive change is and what we can influence. Because if you look at the world you want to see and you identify your role within achieving that world, it can help you establish quite specifically the positive change that you want to deliver. So then, that's on the kind of why we do what we do. On the how, there are 2 elements of what we do that are really brilliant in terms of maybe looking to communicate and engage with different audiences. The first one is understanding our personality as organizations, as businesses. That's about defining and articulating how we do things in our own unique way. So the things that we talked about in purpose, understanding what we're great at, but also maybe how we do that in a distinct way is really useful for us when thinking about reaching different audiences. And finally, our values. Now, values are a really good bridge across both, because one, they help us understand, there are principles, so the non-negotiables that define how we do business. From a driving change point of view, actually our values will shift the role, our imperative for driving change, and maybe look at the areas in which we want to drive changes as businesses. But also, our values are the things that will connect us with with other individuals, and audiences, because they help us, they help people understand maybe how we work and how we behave in a way that is consistent and linked to their values. So looking at this framework, and this is the framework we use within our business to really help businesses understand who they are and how, so that they understand the change they want to see, but also who might help them do that. So it's a really useful framework to spend some time on and really look at how defining kind of who we are. So then once we understand who we are, we then need to understand the audiences and how we help. So I noticed that the panel in the last exercise really talked about, maybe one of the app was quite broad, and they said, you seem to be all things to all people. And a lot of us as organizations try and do that. Ultimately, understanding your audiences beyond demographics is a really useful way of focusing on who you can help and why. So we talk so in order to communicate to changing demographics, I talked about moving beyond just focusing on people's age, gender, that sort of thing, and really understanding their customers. Here are kind of 3 questions that we use within the business to really help us get under the skin of the different audiences and who we might want to help. When we're looking at our customer base, the first thing is we look at who our target audience is. So anytime anyone asks you who your audience is and you reply with a people who, or anyone who, or anybody really, as long as that's way too broad. So we want to focus in on specifically who we can help, and those elements of who we are can really help us understand and refine that. But the other thing is, in terms of moving beyond demographics to really understand how to communicate with people, if we ask these 3 key questions about our audiences, they can really help us get under the skin of why they might, how to communicate with people in a way that's relevant to them. So by asking, first of all, what are the most urgent needs? One of the earlier presentations talked about farmers and talked about targeting farmers and had some really interesting technology that would help farmers. But by understanding and prioritizing the most urgent need of our audiences, it helps us really communicate effectively to them why we're relevant and actually how they can help us achieve change. Secondly, a more positive one is understanding biggest hopes, because actually that helps us understand how we can be a really positive vehicle for change. A lot of technology and a lot of the advances we're seeing are about problem solving. So by understanding not only the challenges and urgent needs of our audiences, but also their aspirations and their vision too, it can really help us communicate to people regardless if the sort of demographic of our audiences changes over time. And the final one, and this links to kind of urgent needs, what keeps our audiences up at night? So what are people really worried about? A lot of the apps that we saw were focused on driving problems and really understanding kind of really problem solving. And again, by understanding what keeps our audiences up at night helps us really communicate effectively with them beyond just using demographic targeting. So these things, once we've identified a specific audience we can help, these can help us delve deep and really communicate with our audiences in an effective way. And they're just some questions that we use for our clients. So then, I've talked about now how we might seek to understand who we are and therefore the positive change we are able and best placed to drive within our organizations and how help our organizations drive wider change in the world. And then I've talked about actually how some ways that we can start to understand our audiences beyond just understanding, who they are, where they live, that sort of thing. I'm now going to talk about how we bring them together, and I hope, I know that we're quite pressed for time, so I hope I'm not going too quickly for you. So in communicating to a changing demographic, we really need to start understanding and building relationships with them. In marketing terms, we call this a customer journey. I'm going to show you a really typical one, and then I'm going to show you how we can use both who we are and also our newfound understanding of our audiences to help us build that relationship over time. So in communicating to a changing demographic, it's really important that we understand that actually communications is not a one-off, and it's not about us just broadcasting out information that we want to tell people. It's about understanding the needs and priorities of our audiences at the different stages they engage with us, and that's called a journey. So here's a typical one that we talk about. So we start with awareness. So that's how people hear about us. We move forward into understanding. So people understanding, looking for more information about what we have to offer. We move then into consideration. People figuring out if we're the ones they're looking for quite specifically. Acquisition, them deciding to buy from us or buy what we have to offer. And retention, really important, how whether people come back to us for more, so it's not just a one-off transaction. The thing I would say about this is, obviously I've put it in a line for the sake of this nice PowerPoint graphic, but it is not always linear. So particularly in what you do, you might find that actually if you're talking about offering an emergency service or something right now and addressing an urgent need, you might see people be aware of you and immediately go to acquisition. But then they might need to go back and find out more information and build sort of their understanding of what you're looking for if they're to come back over time. So people jump between these stages quite a lot. It's not linear anymore. And particularly in the sort of advent of technology and the more choice that people have, we see that a lot, that this is not a linear process. But it is important that we understand what our audiences are looking at each stage. So in terms of communicating with our audiences, particularly in the light of changing demographics, there are kind of three things that we need to do with this. One is it's useful to look at this stage and look at how it applies for our business as an organization. What does this look like? So how do people find us? How do they get more understanding? What information do they need to start thinking about ourselves and really be sort of thinking about considering what we offer? What does that moment of purchase look like for us? And more importantly, what does it take to get people to come back? That will look different depending on all of your businesses, what you do, but it's good to look at that. The second thing is thinking back to what I said about understanding the changing needs of our audiences and understanding sort of their needs, their urgent, what keeps them up at night and their hopes. It helps you understand what people need from you at each one of these stages. So what is the information they need with you to make the decision and move them through the process? And then the other bit of it is that, as we talked about, in order to communicate to shifting and changing demographics, we need to be crystal clear on who we are, how we're different, and actually what's our role in the world, what are we trying to achieve. And actually using this journey to understand how we can demonstrate who we are at each of these phases and stages is really, really key to make sure that we're able to communicate effectively with very differing audiences over an amount of time. So that is a very whistle-stop tour in terms of marketing and brand strategy. I know it's gone super quickly. In short, if we're looking at how we drive positive change and also an ability to communicate to changing demographics, there are three things we need to do. We need to understand who we are, because that helps us understand who we're best placed to help, what the changes are that we're best placed to serve, and also who we might need to communicate to in order to deliver that change. We need to understand our audiences beyond demographics. So even if the profile of what they look like change, their needs and motivations don't, and we understand that. And then we need to create journeys that build a relationship with them over time, so people understand who we are and our audiences understand how we can help too. That's it. From me. I hope that was totally different to anything that you've heard and you're going to hear in the afternoon. I hope it gives you some understanding of how we as marketeers seek to look at how we can identify the positive change we might want to see and also communicate to different audiences no matter what they look like. And I don't think I've got time for questions, but if you have got questions, here's how you contact me in terms of helping. Thank you so much for having me. I really hope that's been helpful. That's it from me. Thank you.